Muhammad is the last and final.
Assalamu alaikum, peace be upon you, and welcome to Hadith Principles. This program is really like a class, and if we will stick with this from beginning to the end, inshallah, we will learn really the basics that we need to know in order to advance in the study of the Hadith of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him. We have in our panel our brother Ilyas from the United States and Muhammad also from the United States, and Brother Muhammad from Egypt. Welcome, brothers, and thank you for being with us. Inshallah, it will be useful and beneficial for all of us, inshallah. What is the goal of studying the principles that we're talking about here, the Hadith principles? And basically, we need to protect the religion of Islam from what are called in the Quran, tahrif and tabdil. That is that in previous religions, as a basic, almost a human weakness that we have, the religions have been distorted, and things that are not of the teaching of the Prophet are introduced, concepts and interpretations, beliefs and practices, and some of their words are changed either in meaning, or their meaning is distorted, or in actual words, things are added or subtracted. And it's almost a human nature to do this. And so it takes careful vigilance, and that is the blessing of the Hadith principles, the great efforts that the Muslim scholars over centuries and centuries who were dedicated to Hadith study and preservation made sure that our religion is sound, that its sources are continuous, uninterrupted, and authentic. And it's the only religion that can say that unequivocally, that we have received our teaching in an unbroken chain from our Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him. Now that is not to disparage anyone and their beliefs and their practices, but we have historical safeguards brought to us by the critics who analyze the Hadith for precision and accuracy in narrating from the Prophet Muhammad. And that was something unique that happened in the Muslim Ummah, the world community of Islam in history. And so we should be very thankful, and we should learn a little bit about this so that we can also benefit. Initially, we talked about the different stages. In the beginning stage, the Hadiths were memorized, and it was an ideal environment for them to preserve and memorize the Hadith of the Prophet. Also, they did record them, but they wrote them down more or less for their own use and for their students' use as a more of a memory aid or tool in the initial stage. Later, in the second and third centuries, large volumes of Hadith were compiled. But those books that were published weren't really divided into the chapters that we're familiar. They weren't organized the way books are. They were just ways of preserving the Hadith in written form so they wouldn't be lost. And then in the classic kind of golden age of the Hadith, famous collections of Hadith, like the two most authentic sources of Bukhari and Muslim, or the Sunan of Abu Dawood, Tirmidhi, Nasa'i, Ibn Majah, and many other books were compiled on subject matter so that you can look up the Hadiths on a particular subject, be it Islamic beliefs or practices or history of the Prophet Muhammad or the companions, and many other areas that make those books really beneficial and useful for people. Finally, when we look at the efforts that the ulama did, in general, we have to appreciate them, but in practice, do we understand them? What were they thinking when they examined the Hadith? What do we mean when we say naqd or the Hadith criticism or critically examine the Hadith? The different books on the Hadith principles speak of different classifications for Hadith. And I know Muslims who are well-informed have heard those, and they may have an understanding of some or others, but a lot of us don't really understand what was the thinking behind that. So first of all, when they looked at the Hadith, of course, there were two parts of the Hadith. Isnad is the chain, the authority by which this hadith is being taught. That is, who did my teacher receive this hadith from? Who is his teacher? Going back, inshallah, to the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him. And then there's the matan, which is the actual wording of the hadith itself. What are the words of the sahabi or narrator of this hadith, the quotation of the Prophet Muhammad, or the description of the Prophet, or his taqreer, or what he accepted? That is the matan, or the actual text itself, while the first part is the isnad or sanad, its chain of authority, what makes this to be accepted as a hadith by the scholars. The first thing that the scholars look at is basically, who is the source? Who is the source of the hadith? Where does it come from? And you can normally tell that when you look at the last name in the list of names in the sanad or isnad, the chain of narrators. Does it say the Prophet said such and such, or I saw the Prophet say such and such? And of course, that is a hadith that is going all the way back to the Prophet Muhammad and is considered then to be the saying or action of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Sometimes you go and you see the companion's name and you don't see the Prophet mentioned. And of course, that hadith, it's not marfu' or going all the way to the Prophet. Instead, that's what's called mawquf. It stops at the name of the companion. And some of those are simply the companion's words, and so they're not really a hadith of the Prophet, while others are in fact having the same authority of a hadith marfu' that is going back to the Prophet, and we will look at those in detail later. And then others, you will see that they don't even go to the companion, and there is a cut between the narrators and the companion, and therefore the person who's narrating the hadith could not have met the Prophet or heard the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and so that is normally not going to be accepted in most cases by most of the scholars as a source for knowing the sunnah or hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So the first thing the ulama look for is the ultimate source of that hadith, and that's usually in the end of the isnad. The second thing they look is at the isnad itself. The isnad, or the chain of narrators, is going from the beginning to the end, or are there perhaps any interruptions or breaks in it? Or is that isnad confused? For example, the order of the people. Are they in the actual order of people who could have met one another, who lived at the same time and same place, or actually were students and teacher, or actually met one another or not? And so it's very important, after knowing the source of the hadith, to know all the people in the chain and whether that chain is actually continuous. Because no matter who they are, and no matter how authentic they are and great sources, if one of them didn't meet the other and didn't actually know the other person, then it could not be considered an authentic hadith. The third thing they look at is how well represented is this hadith among the different narrators. How many narrators taught this hadith or narrated it? How many of the scholars of hadith, how many companions taught that to how many of the next generation? Some hadiths were known widely in every level of their isnad. You will find many sahaba narrated the hadith to many of the tabi'een, the second generation, and many of them to the next generation. And so in every level of the isnad or chain, you will find many different authorities. And so this hadith, it would be nearly impossible for somebody in that case to forge a hadith, for all those people to have gathered together and agreed to forge it or make up a lie. And so that kind of hadith, which we call mutawatir, is considered to be so reliable beyond any other hadith. And actually those are sort of rare. There aren't so many. It doesn't mean that other hadiths are not authentic. It means you can be so confident in the authenticity, the wording and meaning of the hadith because of the number of people involved in transmitting that hadith to us. Another thing which they look at is how specific is the wording of the reporters in the isnad about how they have heard or narrated that hadith. Do they specifically mention, for example, hearing that hadith from their teacher, or seeing a particular thing, or reading it, or did they narrate it from a writing, or did they simply say, as they would say, an, which could mean it comes from this source, but it could imply that it doesn't necessarily come directly from that source. So are they very vague in attributing that hadith to the next person, or are they very specific? And so that will give us confidence, especially depending on the scholars, some of whom are very well known as being very accurate and trustworthy, so their wording isn't quite so important if there's a slight vagueness. But some people are not so well known in their accuracy, and so if there's some vagueness about how they receive that hadith directly from the next scholar or not, that is another thing that the ulama will always look for in the hadith, inshallah. So these are very important criteria that we have to look for when examining the hadiths of Prophet Muhammad, not simply taking it at the isnad alone or the matan alone, but all of those different areas. And so our ulama were very, very precise in how they examined the hadith, giving us precise information that was recorded for us in the principles of a hadith, how to look for this information. They will say, how do these hadith relate to other hadiths? How do these narrators relate to other narrators? For example, you might find a hadith that looks good and the isnad is good, but then you find that there's contradiction between this group of narrators and other hadiths narrated on the same subject. And it looks like this is the same hadith, and yet there is a contradiction between the sources of the hadith. Or the text of the hadith itself, the matan, contradicts other very well-known scholars, or it contradicts many other narrators of hadith. And so we look to, after we've looked at the isnad and the matan, how do the isnad and matan, the text and the chain, relate to other hadiths and other narrators of the hadith, inshallah. After all that, it's still not enough. And we'll come back after a short break and we will talk a little bit more about this subject. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Peace and blessings be on us, sings be on Mustafa.
Assalamu alaikum. Welcome back to Hadith Principles. We're trying to understand the thinking that the ulama or scholars of hadith had when they were examining the hadith for us and authenticating for them. What did they have to look at? And when we understand what they looked at, then we can see how they classified the hadith and what their terminology was for the different hadith that we read about in different books. So they looked at the text of the hadith itself as well as the chain of narrators, the isnad of the hadith. Sometime, after looking at those things very carefully, some of the scholars were also able to discover sometimes hidden defects within the isnad or text. And other factors also, for example, looking at the narrators and their reliability, especially memory-wise, and narrators who perhaps at later stages lost their strong memory. Maybe they were very strong at one time, and as they got older, their memories became weak. And as well as those people who were not trustworthy, who fabricated hadiths or were not reliable and authentic in their narration of the Prophet. So we see all of those things were very important. Let's just talk about some of these terms that we have used. Let's make them very clear. The parts of the hadith. We had number one. What is the first part? Anybody remember?
Look for the source.
Well, no. The first part of the hadith itself is the isnad. And that's the chain of narrators. That's the authority from which you get that hadith. That's why you can say that's a hadith of the Prophet, because it goes directly to the Prophet. And what's the second part called?
Matan.
Matan. And that matan means the actual text, the actual wording of the hadith itself. Okay, and now the scholars would look at the hadith. What were they looking at, and what do you guys understand from that? What were they trying to determine when they looked at the hadith? Obviously, we read it, and it says, from Abu Hurairah, the Prophet said this, and that's it. But they were obviously very, very precise. What did you take away from that, inshallah?
It's authentication.
I mean, the idea is to make it feel like, we can really rely on them. Is there anything that they left out that you can see that you would need to know about these hadith? Is there something missing that we would have to know in order to look at them? They didn't take things by face value. I mean, they looked at each link in the chain. They looked at whether there was any hidden defects in the narration. They looked at whether it contradicts any other sources. So they were very, very precise. And so, inshallah, Muslims should be very confident that we have in the Hadith really a treasure of valuable information. We shouldn't disregard it and think it's not an important source for Islamic studies, inshallah. Yes?
With regards to the first thing that the Sahaba look for, which is who is the source, you said there was the mawquf, the marfu', and the third one where there's a break in the chain. What is that called?
Yeah, it's cut. It's a severance. So sometimes a hadith is narrated, for example, by Tabi, a second generation. And it was in the early years of the 2nd century of Islam, or in the last part of the 1st century, before really there was a lot of the fitna and civil war and controversy in the Islamic world. Famous scholars, and I'll give you some examples, like Hassan al-Basri, for example. Famous scholars of the 2nd generation, they typically narrated hadiths and said, the Prophet said that. And we do that today. I say, the Prophet said, innamal a'malu binniyat. And you guys know I didn't meet the Prophet. So people knew they were trustworthy and they didn't investigate. And so if we don't know the companion, then that makes it difficult for us to accept that hadith. So we have to look for the companion in that. So it's severed. Yes?
Yes, Sheikh. My question is it possible that we have an uninterrupted chain of narration, but still the text is corrupt? Or the opposite, that we have a clear and sound text which is correct according to the Islamic Sharia, and still the isnad is defective or unbroken to like...
Wow, that's very interesting. You know, the more you learn about this area of study, the more you would see that you can never say never. It's possible in both cases. I mean, it's possible that you could have hadith which is apparently da'if and weak, but its meaning is correct. And the ulama will say that hadith has received qubul. It's been accepted by the ummah. The ulama accept the meaning of that hadith, even though they have no isnad that is free of weakness. But the meaning is clearly an authentic meaning. That is possible. And some hadiths are of that classification. So the ulama of fiqh will accept those hadith, even though the ulama of hadith can't find clear chain. The other one is, yes, the chain can appear to be authentic, but there can be, for example, somebody in that chain, for example, sometimes there were certain scholars who were ashamed that, for example, one of their teachers may not have been strong, and he may have felt confident of that hadith himself. So what he did is not mention that teacher. So he mentioned the other person above that teacher, so that you will think that that was his source. And we're going to talk about that. It's called tadlis. We'll talk about that. And so that it can appear to be complete isnad, and it's not actually. And there are other cases where there are hidden defects, or the Ullal hadith, which is a very interesting subject we'll talk about also, inshallah, in class, inshallah.
What about the people who try to fabricate hadith, like the enemies of Islam, and they try to introduce something to corrupt the deen?
Well, there are all kinds of, strange reasons. Some people did that, of course. They felt, for example, that Ali should be the rightful imam. And so they wanted to support his cause. And so it's just like politics for them. It was like politics. So they would, as we know today, make up things to support their cause. Ali, if that happened, would punish the person who did that. But after his time, people still supported his cause very strongly. There was another situation that happened. There were people who felt that any good saying, it belongs to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Any good saying in Arabic or al-amthal or the parables or sayings have a good meaning, those are all belong to the Prophet, and it's okay for us to make up and pretend it is a hadith of the Prophet. And so, of course, there's a lot of wisdom in the world that's not narrated by the Prophet. And so there are many wise people before and after the life of the Prophet who said wise things. The Prophet didn't say everything. And so they felt like anything that is truthful, it's the hadith of the Prophet. And they would make things up, and people would believe them. And then others were just storytellers and people who were fabricating and intentionally introducing information. Some of that was done accidentally. People heard a story from maybe a companion or from the tabi'i, the second generation, and then later on they forgot and they attributed that to the Prophet. And that's also found in the Ullal, or the hidden defects of the hadith, that they actually forgot that the source was a Sahabi, for example, not the Prophet himself. Peace be upon him.
Okay, Sheikh, I have actually point about the word sunnah itself. Sometimes you hear a scholar of fiqh or usul say that this act is based on the sunnah.
Yes.
And sometimes this act is sunnah.
Yes.
So the word sunnah here, a different meaning of...
Yeah, and that's excellent. We should have talked more about that when we talked about the hadith and the sunnah. But the scholars of fiqh, when they say something is the sunnah, they're usually meaning it's recommended practice, it's mustahab or mandub. And those are actually technically better, because in the sunnah, some of the Prophet's rulings in the sunnah are wajib, they are obligatory, and some things are recommended, or some things are just mubah or permitted. So those are all in the sunnah. But when they say it's of the sunnah, they mean the practice of Islam, the practice of the Prophet, the practice of the Sahaba, the practice of the Imams. They used to call all that sunnah in a vague way. You know, tariq al-Islam, the way of Islam. And they used to say about anything that is recommended, it's the sunnah. So I think it's best for us to say it's recommended, it's mustahab or mandub. Then it's clear we mean a fiqh ruling. And if we talk about the sunnah, we mean it's the sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad, not the sunnah of somebody else or the custom of the community or the custom of the people of Medina or anything else. And so the study of hadith requires precision, accuracy, and that is our heritage we received from the scholars. We should respect that and learn more about that, and it will increase our faith and confidence in Islam, inshallah. The ulama made that great effort so that we will receive the guidance and inspiration of the Prophet's sunnah and practice and teaching to us in an unbroken chain of accurate transmission from the Prophet to us. That is a unique blessing that we have in Islam, and therefore we should understand it, guard it, and preserve it to the best of our ability. May Allah Almighty guide all of us and increase our faith in the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad. Peace and blessing be upon him. May Allah Almighty bless all of you. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.